Well, it's a pleasure to have the opportunity to deliver the last word at this convention. So I'm going to start with a couple of methodological claims, I guess, so that you have some sense of what I'm going to do today. I want to talk about both religion and neuroscience, but I want to talk about them in a particular way. Now, it seems to me that the dialogue between two disciplines is only fruitful if it's mutually revelatory, which means that there's no point in studying religion from the perspective of neuroscience unless it can tell you something about neuroscience that you wouldn't otherwise learn. And equally, there's no point in talking about religion from the perspective of neuroscience if neuroscience can't tell you anything you didn't know about religion. Now, what I'm hoping to do today is to offer you a theory that's unified in a number of particular ways. It's scientific in that it adheres to the tenets of objective rationality. I'm not going to tell you anything today that I think will force you to extend your capacity for belief beyond what would be required to formulate your day-to-day beliefs. But I also want to present a theory that's integrally moral in its orientation, and that's something that segregates it from standard objective theories, which virtually by principle have little to say about patterns of action or morality in the world. All right, so that means that the total theory that I present has to be meaningfully descriptive as objective science and moral in the same manner as mythology and religion. Okay. I also want to introduce you to the real title of my talk, which I suppose is an analog of the title I showed you, although it may not seem so at first glance. And I think it's a particularly appropriate title given the nature of this conference, and it should be sufficiently radical to annoy both the neuroscientists and any among you who have particular religious predispositions. It's a neuropsychologically predicated model of why you might be Christ. Okay, well, the first claim I want to make is this, is that there is more than one valid way of construing the world, and I don't think that this is a particularly dramatic claim. It was established originally by David Hume, at least in part, who observed that no matter how much you know about the constituent nature of the material world, there's no infallible way of deriving appropriate moral prescriptions from that knowledge. So just because you have a complete set of rules, say for example regarding the transformations of material reality, that will not provide you with an unerring guide to how you should behave. And I would say that for human beings, although we've been warped in some sense by the tremendous emphasis on science that the Western world has developed in the last 400 years, the primary emphasis for human beings is not precisely what constitutes the descriptive nature of the objective world. And the reason for that is that we aren't information processing machines, despite the fact that modern people tend to use metaphors derived from fields such as computer science. Our primary concern is not so much what is, but what should be. And what that means in large part is that what we're essentially dealing with from moment to moment in the world is how to orient ourselves in the world with regards to action. We want to know not what is so much as what we should do, how we should conduct ourselves, how we should conduct our behavior. And so I would hypothesize to begin with that religion's primary concern is not description of the nature of objective reality, a claim which should hardly be surprising, as the people who conjured up our most fundamental religious stories were by no means scientists in any sense of the word, but the construction of a set of procedures to allow us to orient ourselves in the world and guide our actions. And that means that religious knowledge is essentially dramatic or literary in structure, but that does not mean that it isn't characterized by a valid claim to a form of truth. Now, it's my personal belief that scientific knowledge itself is embedded in a much more fundamental narrative framework. So I would say, insofar as I am a reductionist at all, which I suspect I'm really not, I would say that science can, in the final analysis, be reduced to a set of religious claims, or at least it's embedded in a religious substructure. And that's only because, although science enables us to manipulate objects in the world, we're always manipulating those objects to some end, whether the end is explicit or implicit. The reason that we're interested in science at all is because we use it as a tool to obtain valued goods. So that makes me a pragmatist of sorts in relationship to a philosophy of science. So all of our values are constructed for us and arranged in some sort of logical and comprehensible orientation as a consequence of our participation in an implicit or explicit religious structure. And what I want to do today in large part is lay bare the nature of that implicit religious structure and then relate it explicitly to models of neuropsychological functioning. And I hope by the end of the lecture that I'll have provided you with a framework that will allow you to understand in a more rich manner many of the things that you've heard at this conference, but that I'll also lead you to a place where you actually will believe, at least in part, that that title might represent something that's more than merely a form of kind of high comedy. I want to show you something first written by Shakespeare. I mean, Shakespeare said the following: all the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. Well, Shakespeare, of course, is the English world's premier dramatist, a literary genius, a man who is capable of encapsulating for all time compelling patterns of action that serve us as a standard and overwhelmingly profound models of behavior, both for good and for evil. Well, Shakespeare is part of an endless panoply of creative and gifted literary and religious figures whose primary cognitive characteristic is their ability to abstract out patterns of behavior as a consequence of their observation of others, and to present us with what are essentially distilled representations of our own modes of being. So you could think about mythological stories and religious stories as a consequence of an endless process of distillation that extends over centuries, the purpose of which is to make clearer to each of us the central nature of the stories that have to guide our lives. Now, we know already that human beings can communicate with one another. And what that means is that we share an implicit belief about the structure of reality. If that wasn't the case, all our communication would be an infinite regress, which would mean that no matter what you said to me, I would constantly demand another level of explanation. And because our knowledge is finite, I would never get to the point where I could answer any of your questions. We share an underlying commonality of emotion and motivation. There's certain plots and narrative types that we can naturally identify and resonate with that don't have to be explained to us, but that instead form the basis for all of our understanding. The literary and religious process is in part the centuries-long process of the distillation of these narrative patterns and their formulation in a form that can't be exceeded in terms of its elegance and sophistication. Now, the thing that's strange about this form of distillation is that it produces kinds of knowledge that are complex beyond our capacity to understand. Now, you might think, well, how is it that we can generate forms of knowledge that we can't understand? Well, we do this all the time. Take the example of children. By the time a child is 4 years old, if he or she has been properly socialized, he exists as the embodiment of a set of complex moral rules, virtually none of which are explicit with the child, with regards to the child, but all of which are implicit, which is to say the child acts out a pattern of morality that he's learned as a consequence of his observations of social reality. That pattern of behavior that the child manifests is complex beyond his own capacity to describe, but nonetheless he exists as a representation of that structure. Well, you could say equally well that because our own natures are complex beyond our capacity to understand, hence the need for a psychology, that we constantly embody forms of information that exceed our capacity to explicitly represent. And what literary and religious geniuses do, prophetic figures like Dostoevsky or the Old Testament prophets, is bring those complex patterns of social behavior up to explicit light and reveal to us explicitly for the first time just exactly what it is that we've been doing all along. There's no necessary conflict between religion and science, as far as I'm concerned. The conflict arises as a consequence of a kind of philosophical misapprehension on two sides. The philosophical misapprehension on the part of the religious individual, particularly with regards to fundamentalists, is the notion that religious stories, cosmologies for example, are in some light in the same philosophical class as scientific theories about the origins of the material world. Well, the people, as I said before, who constructed these stories weren't scientists in any sense of the word. They existed long before the scientific methodology was formalized. They didn't have the measurement tools necessary to make the kind of claims that scientists make, and they didn't have the philosophical orientation to do such to begin with. Well, so the religious fundamentalist errs in identifying his set of beliefs with the same class of beliefs as science. The scientist errs by presuming that the religious theory is a form of pre-scientific pseudo-superstition that was supplanted by current higher-order knowledge. Well, as long as you understand that religious stories are concerned with the description of appropriate patterns of action, as Shakespeare is alluding to, then you can understand the essential distinction between the two modes of thought. Now, I would also say that religious belief the religious world is essentially phenomenological rather than materialistic. And what that means is that from the religious perspective, what is real is not what is material, but what is experienced. And that means from the religious perspective, reality is the totality of experience. And the totality of experience includes all the mysterious objects that philosophers of science call qualia. So from the religious perspective, anger and shame and guilt and pain and dreams and fantasies are all of a reality that's equivalent to manifestations of the objective world in the field of experience. And what religious stories are concerned with is not representation of the objective world, but representation of the field of experience so that this field can be represented and then acted in appropriately. And appropriately means subject to certain preconditions, like the sustenance of life and the ability of individuals to group together in harmonious social organizations, and the possibility for a world that's characterized both by order, security, and predictability, but also by sufficient flexibility to remain adaptive in the face of constant change. Lao Tzu, in the Tao Te Ching, described the essential structure of experience from the religious perspective. Lao Tzu said, "The Tao existed before its name, and from its name, the opposites evolved, giving rise to three divisions, and then to names abundant. These things embrace receptively, achieving inner harmony, and by their unity create the world of man." Now, a modern Western reader presumes immediately that this is a form of metaphorical representation, but it's not. It's a very, very clear statement of a conception of reality as experienced. And part of what I'm going to do today is to explain to you what I believe the constituent elements of this reality are, and also how they interact, because it's the interaction of these constituent elements that constitutes a narrative, or more profoundly, a myth or a religious story. From its name, the opposites evolved, giving rise to three divisions. From the Taoist perspective, this is a map of the world, but it's not a map of the objective world. It's a map of the world as experienced. And the world as experienced universally and across all conceivable contexts is characterized by the interplay of two states and one process. The states are as follows. Wherever you are, regardless of circumstance, you're in an environment characterized by a domain of familiarity, which is all those things you know about the circumstance, and a domain of unfamiliarity, which is the infinite sea of complexity that underlies everything that you're capable of understanding about that situation. So you could say that in the course of centuries of religious thought, attempting to provide the most high-order abstract representation of environments, religious perspectives from around the world have converged on the following proposition. The world is made out of chaos and order. Chaos is the metaphorical representative of that domain of complexity that you're incapable of understanding, merely because it is so exceedingly complex. And so you could say, for example, that a person that you know intimately, from your perspective, is a constant interplay of chaos and order. They're orderly in that you can predict their behavior to a certain degree, but they're chaotic in that no matter how well you know someone, they're characterized by an infinite capacity to reveal constantly expanding layers of complexity, some of which are very positive and which help you stay oriented to and interested in that person, and some of which are infinitely troublesome. And you can say the same thing about any circumstance that you encounter in the natural world. And I can give you a very quick example of that. You're going to work. You want to go to work. That's your ideal for the day. You go out into your driveway and you see your car. You think your car is a material object, but it's not. It's a process and a function. And it's defined as a car not because of the constituent elements that compose it from a materialistic perspective, but because it performs a certain function, which is its ability to transport you from a place that you don't want to be to a place that you want to be. And the reason that you can apprehend this complex object as a car is because under optimal circumstances it performs that role seamlessly. So you get into your car and you put the key in the ignition and you turn the key, and instead of the comfortable purr that you expect, you hear a terrible mechanical grinding and the engine shudders to a halt. And what you think for a moment is that you're sitting in a car, but the truth of the matter is that you're not sitting in a car at all. What you're sitting in is an object whose underlying and heretofore invisible complexity has just manifested itself as a disruption in your plans. And if you continue to act as if what you're sitting in is a car, you will not get to work, and you will be in for a very frustrating ride. Now you think about it this way. You don't understand that car at all, unless you happen to be a very advanced mechanic. It's only a car, which is a simple object of apprehension, insofar as it performs its function flawlessly. As soon as that function is disrupted by the emergence of chaos, the car has to be considered as an extraordinarily complex array of constituent elements, any of which might have failed to produce the unfortunate turn of events that is preventing you from going to work. Well, you know, all of you, and everything I tell you today is going to be a form of Platonic memory. You all know that wherever you go, you're skating on thin ice, which is to say that you've constructed up a functional adaptive representation of a very complex environment. And under the best of conditions, that complex representation retains its functionality. But because you're vulnerable and you're mortal, and because your knowledge is by necessity finite, the terrible underworld of complexity can reveal itself in all its potential and splendor at any given moment. Chaos and order. Two broad metaphorical domains. The Taoists are very, very sophisticated. They believe that Tao, which is equivalent to meaning, at least in certain translations, is the combined interaction of chaos and order. And that the most meaningful element in any environmental circumstance is the boundary between the two domains. Well, what does that mean? Well, when you're talking to someone, you want them to say things you understand. That's the orderly domain. But you also want them to say things you don't understand, because otherwise there's no point in talking to them. But you don't want them to say things that are too incomprehensible, because then there's no point in talking to them. And what you want them to do is walk the thin line between chaos and order. And not only that, you want to see them dramatize that walk while they're talking to you. And if they do that, then you'll find their actions compelling in a remarkable way and intrinsically meaningful, and that's what it means to have a conversation that's worthwhile. And you can say that the person who you're conversing with or listening to is in consequence existing, at least for that moment, in a state that's characterized by the harmonious interplay between chaos and order, and that they're embodying a kind of process, and that process is the mediation between what's understood and familiar and known and what still remains to be revealed. You think about it this way. You watch an extraordinarily sophisticated gymnast. This is someone who's practiced the discipline perhaps for 15 years, 4 or 5 hours a day. They're absolutely stellar with regards to their own physical control. But they go through the routine in a kind of rote manner. And you get the sense of technical perfection, but nothing else. And you clap and you think, well, that was a remarkable performance, but you don't give it 9.9 out of 10. By contrast, you see another gymnast who steps out onto the stage, and you can tell by the very mode of their action that they're standing right on the edge of catastrophe, that they're unbelievably disciplined, but they're also tremendously courageous, and every single movement they make puts them right on the edge of the abyss. And everyone in the crowd is incredibly captivated by the performance because they dramatically embody the interaction between disciplined order and chaos. And not only is that a brilliant performance from the physical perspective, but it's a brilliant performance from the metaphysical perspective, because, at least for the moment, they're dramatically embodying the aspect of the world of consciousness that constantly extracts order from chaos. Well, what exactly does chaos consist of? Well, I think for that answer to that question, we're going to turn to an old cartoon from the 70s, written by a man who smoked way too much marijuana. And this is a cartoon derived from a head comic called The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, and one of the Freak Brothers has a cat. And this is a city cat, and I don't know how many of you have cats, but you know they hate to move. They don't like to be moved, they like their house. And if you move them, it makes them very, very anxious, despite the fact that they're predatory. And that's because when you move a cat, it doesn't know what the hell's going on. It doesn't like that intrinsically. It hates that. So Fat Freddy takes his cat. It's been traveling in this box, and he picks it up and he shows it the forest. And he says, "This is our new home." And the cat thinks, "So this is the country." And then the cat does what animals actually do when they're exploring, which is to crouch into a posture that makes them maximally invisible to predators, and begins to explore in exactly the manner that animals do explore, which is primarily with their olfactory sense. And the cat slowly slinks out past its domain of competence, sniffing all the while to absorb new information, and at one point it passes the boundary from order and enters the domain of chaos, and that turns on its intrinsic affective system and shoots it back under the house, which is what it's doing here. And the other hippie says, where'd the cat disappear to now? And Fat Freddy says, under the house. And then you see this visual image that the cat has constructed as it's sitting there terrified, which is you'd hide too if you'd smelled what I did. And what it smelled was this chimerical figure composed of an amalgam of things that are extraordinarily terrifying to cats. And it stands as the cat's first order representation of all the terrible things that might be lurking in the unknown forest. So you see it's got the tail of a skunk and the face of a wolf, and it's got the horns of a deer and the feet of a duck and so forth and so on, and it's a monster. All right, so then you take a look at a figure like this, and this is a figure from Hindu religion. This is Kelly, and what you see about Kelly is that she's an amalgam of instinctual fear stimuli. And the reason that she's an amalgam of instinctual fear stimuli is because Kelly is a metaphorical representation of the class of all things that makes you want to run away when you look at them. And one of the things that distinguishes us from computers is that, well, a computer does only the things that it understands, and if it's ever forced to do something it doesn't understand, it promptly crashes, and then you're left with dealing with the anomaly. But human beings, the thing that makes us different from computers is that we don't just deal with what we know, we deal with what we don't know, and we have to deal with what we don't know, because if we don't, it will kill us. So we have to make representations of the broad and strange class of all things that we don't understand, so that we can begin to understand how it is that we come to terms with the things that we don't understand. And Kelly is one of the ways that we've done that. Now, you've got to take a close look at her, because you're looking at her and she doesn't frighten you. And the reason for that is because you can't understand the visual metaphors. So I'm going to explain them, and then you can decide if Kelly is a frightening figure. Okay, so first of all, she's a spider. That's why she has 8 legs. And she's a spider because people don't like spiders, and that's because they bite us and poison us. And it's easy to condition fear to spiders, for example, much easier than to condition fear to pistols, for example. So Kelly's a spider, and why is that? Well, it's because we don't like spiders, but it's also because spiders spin the web of fate and trap the unwary. And Kelly's a representation of that domain of doom that awaits you when you constantly make the same stupid mistake over and over. So she's a spider, and she waits for you. Well, she's not just a spider, because her web is made out of fire. And the reason it's made out of fire is because we happen to be in the class of creatures that can't look away from fire. It's absolutely attractive to us. It's compelling. And so that gives her a kind of numinous aspect. Her head's on fire, too. Her hair is made out of fire. And she wears as a tiara a headdress of skulls. Well, that's fairly nasty, but it doesn't stop there. Classical representations of Kelly also tend to give her the tongue of a tiger, very aggressive visage, which is another sort of instinctual fear stimuli, incredibly aggressive and staring eyes. And as well, generally, she's represented by a cobra wrapped around her waist, and that's partly because we don't like snakes much, being primates, but they're very, very fascinating to us. Also, the snake is a figure of transformation because it sheds its skin and is reborn. Well, that's bad enough, I would guess, except you also have to understand what Kelly's doing to this poor gentleman that she happens to be resting upon. And what she's doing to him is simultaneously giving birth to him and devouring him intestines first. Well, you can understand now, having been walked through the visual aspects of the metaphor, just precisely what this figure represents. Now, what's really interesting about this figure is that Kelly is an object of sacrifice. Now, sacrifice has been a tough nut to crack from the perspective of the history of religion. What does it mean to make a sacrifice? Well, it means something like this. You have to give up what you love best in order not to encounter Kelly. And what does that mean? It means this. If the same terrible thing is happening to you over and over again, it's because you're possessed by a set of rigid presuppositions which you're adhering to as if they're representations of a totalitarian truth. And that's the thing you love best, and the reason you love it best is because your firm grip on that belief structure is what helps you orient yourself in the complex chaos of the world, so you don't want to let it go. But if it's a partial representation, it can constantly lead you into trouble. If you don't sacrifice the thing you love best, there's no possibility of forward movement, and that means that Kelly is going to be a figure that constantly reveals itself. If you do undergo the appropriate sacrificial rituals, removing those obstacles to your growth that you yourself have placed in your path, you have the option of turning the terrible destructive aspect of chaos into its benevolent counterpart, which is, of course, the purpose of sacrificial rituals. This is Diana, not Kelly, not Hindu, but Greek and Roman, but she stands as the class of feminine figures representing chaos, the benevolent aspect, multi-breasted, benevolent. Well, why? Well, it's because the complexity that underlies your conceptions can rise up and kill you, which frequently it does in actuality. I mean, you think you understand the nature of your physical being, that you understand it because it isn't posing any problems to you. At some point in your life, and in all of our lives, something will go wrong with part of you that you don't understand, and the consequence of that reemergence of your own invisible complexity will, in the final analysis, be your demise. That's the negative aspect of the complexity that underlies things. The positive aspect is the fact that all those things you don't understand compel you forward and allow you to extract out new information from the world. So you always want to be balanced on the edge between order and chaos, because if you can move into the unknown with a certain degree of certainty and courage, you can constantly extract enough revelatory information so that you can build yourself into a sufficiently complex being to deal with the complexity of life. If you're sufficiently humble and willing to eradicate your erroneous presuppositions as you march forward into the future, you have the constant possibility of transforming the complexity that Kelly represents into the complexity that this figure of Diana represents. All right, so that's the unknown nature. That might be one metaphor. This is the known. This is Gary Larson, The Far Side. Gary Larson's a pretty funny cartoonist. Here's this guy. He's telling ghost stories to these kind of ugly little sort of Cub Scouts, and he says, and then the frantic whirring blades of the electric motor cause a sudden reversal of the airflow, and whoosh, that's how a vacuum cleaner works. Ha 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 ha. Tales of the known. Well, right. Well, no one tells jokes about the known because there's nothing funny about the known, right? There's nothing unexpected about it. You're not going to make the hair stand up on the back of these little chubby gentlemen by telling them about how a vacuum cleaner works. You want to tell them a story about some metaphorical equivalent to Kelly, and that will be sufficient to ensure that their dreams will be haunted by the appropriate kind of nightmares. What is the known? Well, the known is culture, broadly put, but it's more than that. It's the hierarchical structure of beliefs that make up our shared social systems. Look, here we are, none of us know each other, right? And we've been able to engage in a pretty peaceful discussion about pretty complex and controversial topics for 4 whole days. Why? Well, it's because we share an entire substrata of a priori beliefs about how behavior should be conducted. And we don't violate those in the presence of others. We all act out a certain kind of role. That's why we wear ties. That's why we wear suits. It's a signal to the rest of the primates that we're basically in the same tribe, and the probability that you'll get bitten if you interact with me is virtually 0. So you can treat me essentially as an object that's known. And what you want from me is just enough new information so that you're interested but not terrified. And the game we play is the constant exchange of just enough chaos to remain interesting. Assume that we're not totalitarian to the point of utter boredom. And in that manner, we manage to tolerate the presence of all these complex others and to benefit from the mutual interaction. The known. Well, you could construe the known as the wise king. And the wise king is that implicit figure that constitutes a personification of the body of laws that guide our behavior towards predictability. Well, what's the problem with the wise king? Well, the problem with the wise king is that he frequently turns into a tyrant. And a tyrant is someone who says, like Milton's Satan, that everything that's currently known is all that needs to be known, and that there's no room whatsoever in this world for any bits of troublesome chaos, including those that happen to reside in the breasts of troublesome and creative others. So the totalitarian attempts to eradicate novelty wherever he sees it, to help bolster his belief that he knows absolutely everything that's worth knowing, and to ensure that the world remains in an absolutely predictable and regular course. Well, of course, the world can't remain in an absolutely predictable and regular course because it's really, really complicated, and it changes just like a river, and if you try to presume that the river is a photograph of the river, well, you can be bloody sure that you'll drown, because rivers rise up from time to time and cover those who aren't sufficiently wary to understand that everything is constant and necessarily constant, but by the same token, everything necessarily changes. Well, the prototypical tyrant is, of course, the man who devours his own son, and what that means is that he's a pathological representation of the master of the apprentice. Well, a good master produces a student who's extraordinarily disciplined, as in the case of the gymnast that I described earlier, but a good master does something more than that. The purpose of a master, which is the appropriate king, is to produce a son who's mastered everything the king knows, and yet who still is capable of embodying the kind of creative and exploratory spirit that can transcend that disciplinary order and update it when it becomes necessary to update it, because things constantly change. Well, another way that you can conceptualize that son is in this manner. This is St. George and the Dragon, an unbelievably common symbolic motif in the Middle Ages, a notion that has a written history reaching back to the Sumerians, which is basically as far back as we can reach in written history. And what does St. George do? Well, St. George is a class of martial hero, and this is basically his story. The kingdom is threatened by the reemergence of forces once conquered. Its structure is threatened. A courageous individual goes beyond the boundaries of what's currently established and known and faces the unknown in single combat, defeating it. As a consequence of its defeat, the treasure that the dragon hoards is granted to the hero, who brings it back in the form, well, in this particular case, of a virgin princess, brings it back to the general community and updates the structure. Classic hero story. The hero is fostered by the community, leaves its boundaries, goes into the unknown, represented by the dragon. Represented by the dragon, by the way, because a dragon is a combination of metaphors of matter, which is why it's a snake, and metaphors of spirit, which is why it's a bird. It's a symbolic representation of Tao, Tao being the place from which spirit and matter is extracted in the course of exploratory activity, which is only to say that when you encounter something unknown, you explore it. As a consequence of your exploratory ability, you conjure up the world on the one hand, and I don't mean that metaphorically, and you conjure up your own personality structure on the other hand, and I don't mean that metaphorically. And you could consider yourself a miner of information from this particular perspective, and you could consider this essential substrate of being not as material, but as something more like latent information. So then your constituent elements of the world start to look something like this, and this is a 14th century Christian representation, and what you basically see here is the figure of Mary. This is only the positive constituent elements of the world. Mary representing the constant benevolent and generative aspect of experience. God the Father, in this peculiar representation, shown as subordinate in a way to Mary, which is very peculiar from a Christian perspective, but very logical from a psychological perspective. God the Father representing the benevolent aspect of social order, and Christ as a representation of the individual who's spanning the gap constantly between order and chaos, and embodying what Christians describe as logos, which is the creative word, which is, by the way, according to Genesis, the process that extracts out the orderly and habitable world from the underlying chaos. And you can look at that graphically like this, and you can say, this is what experience is, and this is what our stories are about. Our stories are about the chaotic world that makes up everything that we don't understand, parsed into those things that are creative and those things that are destructive. The beautiful aspect of nature and the aspect of nature that's characterized by parasitical worms, malarial mosquitoes, earthquakes, diseases, viruses, and so forth. On top of that being the structured order that we lay upon this world in order to be able to inhabit it, the Great Father, social order, orderly, providing us with the kind of structure that we need in order to flourish and survive, and tyrannical, because adherence to any form of social order demands a certain voluntary mangling and discipline of the spirit. On top of that, like a man standing on an island in an ocean, is the individual. Heroic, embodied by figures like Christ, for example, or by the individual who exists in Tao, and also adversarial, embodied by figures like Milton's Satan, who's an embodied personification of a behavioral process that's characterized by the desire for destruction. Another way of construing this is this. This is the dragon of chaos within that underlying complexity, which is literally ineffable, meaning beyond words, because by the time it's carved up into words, it's no longer the complex chaos that underlies being, but some parsed up element of the world, the ineffable aspect of existence, the unknown as you confront it in your own life, day to day, moment to moment, week to week, in minor ways, which are merely upsets, and in dramatic ways, which are the catastrophes that may destroy you, but that sometimes allow you to entirely transform your life. The knower, the individual, standing on the border between what's unknown and what's known, benefiting from the protective aspect of social order, but constantly serving to revitalize and transform that order when necessary. That's the role of the hero. Okay, so now I want to tell you a dream. About 7 years ago, I went to my sister's-in-law, and she had, you don't have to read this, it's just to remind me. I went to my sister-in-law, she has this little kid, he's about 5 years old, very, very bright kid. Okay, so you watch him zipping around all the time. He's got this little night hat, plastic, he's wearing that, and he's got this sword. And he zooms around the house in a way that would get an adult instantly put into an insane asylum, chopping up imaginary foes and acting out the part of the hero. And we think, well, that's remarkably cute, and certainly it is cute, but it's a hell of a lot more than just cute. So the problem this kid has is this. Following the previous 6 months, he's got night terrors, which means, from a medieval perspective, that demons from hell are coming to visit him and sitting on his chest, but of course we wouldn't believe that in an enlightened modern age. But whatever the situation is, repeatedly he wakes up in the middle of the night screaming for his mother. Okay, so what's going on in this household? Well, first of all, the kid has to go to kindergarten. So that means he's moving beyond the boundaries of what's really familiar for him, right? It's a real existential challenge for him to make the transition. But worse, a year later, his parents are divorced. So what does that mean? Well, it means that underlying the apparent regularities of the current social order of the household are unspoken elements of chaos that are going to emerge and destroy his social order, which he dimly apprehends with his extremely sophisticated threat detection mechanisms and conjures up in nightmare form during his dreams. So, I'm there watching this kid, and that night he has night terrors, and he wakes up screaming for his mother. So the next day, he sits at the table, and I said to him, okay, Graham, what'd you dream about? And he says, now, he snaps into that zone between order and chaos, right? That's the zone where a speaker has your attention. And he snaps into it because he's about to relate something of real importance. And you can tell that because you're interested in it, even though you can't necessarily tell why. And he says, well, I dreamt that I was surrounded by these little dwarfs with beaks. They didn't have any arms, they just had beaks, and they were only as high as my knees, and they were covered with hair and grease, and they had a cross shaved in the top of their head, and wherever I went, these dwarfs jumped at me with their beaks and were biting me. We all looked at him, this is a horrifying image coming from a 5-year-old. But it got worse. He said, okay, well, in the background there's a great dragon, and every time this dragon breathes out fire and smoke, the fire and smoke turn into these dwarfs, and they keep multiplying. Well, I don't think you really have to use your imagination that much to understand what that means. What that means is that you're always facing things in your life that are threatening to you, and they breed and multiply beyond your capacity to control. And that means that for every specific fear that you have, there's a phenomena that can be construed as a general generator of feared phenomena. And you could consider that the underlying complexity of the world. So I said to Graham, using a loaded question, the kind that you can't use to lead a jury, for example, I said, what could you do about this dragon? And he brightened up immediately, because that's a good subtle hint saying you could do something about this situation. He said, I'd grab my dad, I'd take my sword, I'd go to where the dragon lived, I'd jump up on its head and pop out both of its eyes. Then I go down its throat to the box where the fire comes out. So that's to the center of the thing that produces the feared phenomena. I'd carve out a piece of it, and I'd make a shield. Well, I tell you, for me, that was absolutely overwhelming. I couldn't believe it, because that is a perfectly detailed archetypal hero myth, spontaneously generated as a consequence of this child's process of adaptive thought. Interestingly enough, and you probably won't believe this, but it is true, and I've checked it multiple times, that was the end of his night terrors. So he catalyzed identity with the hero who mediates between chaos and order, and as a consequence, his nightmares went away. Well, those of you who are clinicians should well know that if you want to cure somebody of their fears, what you always do is voluntarily expose them to them. And the reason for that is that despite the terror, redemptive information exists in the unknown. And if you can expose people who are running away from things they don't understand under controlled conditions to those things that they're avoiding, they can extract out the corrective information from the situation that they've been avoiding and rebuild their personality so that they can adapt to the world. Now, this is a story. It's the most fundamental element of a story. And a story is a frame that allows us to conjure up objective representations of the world. And a basic story looks something like this. We're somewhere, and we want to go somewhere else. And when you tell a story, that's what you tell. I was here, and I wanted to go there. It can be concrete or it can be abstract, but it's always a journey. A narrative is a journey. And that's because we're linear creatures. We're always trying to go from a place we don't like, whatever that happens to be, to a place we do like. And we evaluate the entire world as a consequence of this laid-on interpretive template. And this is something that's reasonably well established from the perspective of the neuropsychology of emotion. Basically a cybernetic model. It's been elaborated in great detail by multiple scholars whose names I can give you if you're interested. Okay, well, what happens to you when you're going from point A to point B? Well, basically what happens to you are irrelevant things, virtually everything. And that's a good thing because the world's very complex and you can only attend to a very limited amount of it. So irrelevant things. Like the floor that I happen to be standing on. Completely irrelevant unless it moves. So as long as it's performing its invisible function, I don't attend to it. Good things can happen to you. And a good thing is what moves you closer to your destination. By definition, your brain responds with the production of neurochemicals like dopamine to stimuli that indicate that your path is unfolding like it should. Bad things can happen to you. Things that get in your way. Frustrations, disappointments, violations of expectation, punishments. Well, there's an interesting class of bad things that can happen to you while you're trying to get to where you're going. That class is novelty or anomaly. Well, it's one thing to encounter a punishment that's predictable. So you're a little kid, you write in magic marker on a freshly painted wall. You know, hopefully, that there will be a consequence to that, and you hope, really, that the consequence will emerge, because if the punishment doesn't follow the crime, as in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, then all that is evidence that there's no moral order in the world. And if you think punishment is bad, you should try evidence that there's no moral order in the world. Well, what can happen to you when you're going from point A to point B? Things you don't like, things you like, and things you don't expect. Well, of all the things that can happen to you when you're going from point A to point B, things you don't expect are the worst. Little ones, they're not so bad. They might be interesting. You're reading a book on the way to the elevator. Somebody's put a chair in the hallway. Well, it's a little bit annoying and unexpected. You move it. You go into your boss's office expecting a raise. You find out the company's been sold, and you're fired. Well, that's the kind of unexpected thing that destroys the substrata of your currently operative belief system and plunges you immediately into chaos. Well, a little aggravation means that you have to choose a different way of getting from point A to point B. A major aggravation, by contrast, means that you have to reframe the manner in which you're construing the world. Students write the MCAT, their graduate record exams, attempting to go to graduate school. They get a numeric index of their potential fit. Student works for 5 or 6 years, predicated on the notion that they understand the place on which they stand. I'm smart. I'm going to be a doctor. I write the GRE. I get my results. 15th percentile. Uh-oh. I'm not going to be a doctor. But that's bad enough, because all of a sudden my future is now characterized not by predictability, but by emergent complexity. Worst of all, maybe I'm not smart. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means maybe the way I've construed myself for the last 16 years is wrong. Maybe I've been applying a fundamental axiom of belief to the world that's inappropriate. So that means that the past, which we presume is fixed, is not fixed at all, but can also be turned into a domain of chaos by the emergence of unexpected information. Plus, then there's the present. Oh, I'm not going to be a doctor. What the hell am I going to do? Well, what do people do in a circumstance like that? They descend into the underworld. And that underworld is emergent complexity. And that underworld is the world that lies under our normal presuppositions. And they descend into that underworld, and sometimes they don't get out. And that's the heroic adventurer in the archaic story who's swallowed up by the beast and who ends up for eternity in the belly of the beast until, if he's fortunate, he's rescued by a hero. Alternatively, you go into that domain of chaos, which is extraordinarily informative but very, very hard to cope with, and you think, I didn't really want to be a doctor. Now, I'm presuming that this isn't merely a self-deceptive maneuver. I only wanted to be a doctor because my father and my grandfather was a doctor. Maybe the reason I did so damn poorly on that graduate record exam or MCAT is because, I don't really want to do this. I want to be an engineer or an artist or a teacher or whatever this kind of lurking tendency towards self-realization is impelling me towards. So in this domain of chaos, if you're fortunate, you pick up the pieces, so to speak, of the shattered social structure, the internal social structure, and you rebuild your personality as a consequence. Well, that's a heroic descent into the unknown, into hell if you'll have it that way, and then a reconstruction of the world. Well, and you can conceive of that in this manner. The damaged kingdom, the emergent hero, the dragon of chaos, and the reconstruction of society. The liberation of redemptive information as a consequence of the voluntary journey into the unknown. The central story of human adaptation. So then you say, well, what does that make the individual human being? That makes the individual human being who's actually operating at a moral level. And I mean a moral level whose morality transcends mere cultural interpretation, constantly serving as the person who's properly disciplined and socialized by their particular cultural milieu, constantly capable of transcending that socialization, constantly willing to move into the domain of complexity that surrounds everything we do, to face it bravely despite its complexity, to pull in the treasure that that complexity holds, and to spread it back around the community, and therefore to renew it. And as far as I'm concerned, you all know that story. And the reason you know it is not necessarily because you know it explicitly, but because every damn thing you've ever read that's narrative in structure, literary, religious, or mythological, has that fundamental grammatical substructure, which is striving, so to speak, to reveal itself constantly so that you can embody it in action. And perhaps now, because we're sufficiently cognitively sophisticated to understand the grammar of our behavior, possibly explicitly, so that we can realize what it means to embody the force that constantly pulls order out of chaos. Or alternatively, and not infrequently, to transform pathological order into chaos in the case of the social revolutionary, and then to recast the world as a consequence of that. Well, let's look briefly at a neuropsychological model. I know I only have about 5 minutes left, but I'll just give you a quick run-through because there's one thing in particular that I want to say with regards to neuropsychology that's extraordinarily interesting. Now, this is more or less the way your brain works. I mean, this is a pretty low-resolution model, okay, and I'm going to run through it quick. But basically what happens is that you conjure up a vision of the way that you'd like things to be. And that can be a complex and comprehensive vision, or it can be something like, I'm a little bit hungry, and maybe I'd like to have a cheese sandwich. And so you envision the world in which you currently reside as damned by the lack of sufficient cheese sandwiches, so to speak, and you envision a kind of paradise where you're happily engaged in constructing and then consuming that cheese sandwich, and then you organize your behavior so that you transform the chaos, unproductive chaos that currently exists into the thing that you'd like it to be. And your emotions, complex as they are, guide you in that process, making you feel properly incentive motivated as you spread butter on your piece of white bread. All right. Or that can be something incredibly complex, like your vision of a more desired future for everyone as well as for you, and your capacity to bring that into action by performing the appropriate kinds of transformations. Doesn't matter, contents differ, form of story remains constant across contexts. Your prefrontal cortex conjures up the vision of the future. Your sensory cortex analyzes those aspects of the world that you presume are relevant to your current task. A very minor subset of the total world because the world's too complex for you to comprehend. You build up a provisional plan and engage it in action. Use your prefrontal cortex as a template that produces what should be, and use your sensory cortex as a way of assessing the world's transformation to that desired point. If everything goes according to plan, you're reasonably and mildly happy. Once you've consummated your desire, you move on to the next story. There's a part of your brain underneath the prefrontal and frontal lobes and sensory cortex called the limbic system. You heard a little bit about that before. composed for my purposes primarily of the hippocampus and the amygdala. The hippocampus is the part of your brain that always tells you when you're an idiot. And it's a small voice, but it's one that you have to listen to. And the way it tells you you're an idiot is like this. You lay out a plan, and you act it out, and it doesn't work. And the hippocampus goes, click, mismatch. That's its function, mismatch. You're wrong. It doesn't tell you why you're wrong, because all it does is tell you that you're wrong. It tells you that you're wrong. Well, then your prefrontal cortex has to figure out why you're wrong. What happens when you're wrong? Well, the amygdala gets disinhibited. And what the amygdala does is say, oh, you're wrong. You don't know where you are. Since you don't know where you are, you might get hurt. Since you might get hurt, you better be afraid. So as soon as you're wrong, you're afraid. Well, then you can run away. But then if you encounter the situation again, you're just as big an idiot as you were before. Well, so then what do? Well, this is an existential paradox. You advance courageously towards the source of your error with proper humility and with the willing to make appropriate sacrifices, and you gain information as a consequence. Reconstruct your mode of interpretation and move towards your desired future. The amygdala, I said, is disinhibited. Why is that? Well, because the brain is set up in a really interesting way. Here's how it's set up. Its default position is terror and awe. And you can think about that as a manifestation of Rudolf Otto's revelation of the numinous. If you don't understand it, it's ineffable. You can't put it into words. And it's awe-inspiring, terrifying, and unbelievably compelling, as it should be, because it is a manifestation of the underlying complexity of the world, which offers you everything that there is potentially to offer, including the threat of violent and painful death. Well, you're in awe before that. Okay, next thing. This is really, really fascinating, I think. Joseph Ledoux, behaviorist. So he probably wouldn't agree with many of the things I'm going to say, but I don't care that much about that. I'm adjoining his model with a complex cybernetic model, and it's more appropriate. It's a more appropriate interpretation. Your emotions orient you when you don't know what the hell you're doing. Well, something has to. You don't know what you're doing, so it can't be your cognitions, right? If they were right, you wouldn't be where you don't expect to be. They're wrong. So what do you do when you're wrong? Well, what you do, essentially, is become terrified. But more than that, you become a battleground of all sorts of competing emotional states. And you could think about those as action potentials. And it's logical that when you don't know what the hell you're doing, you should be characterized by competing action potentials, because you might have to fight, you might have to run, you might have to suffer damage, you might have to get away, you might have to stop, you might have to explore. You don't know. So all of those potentials emerge as the underlying affective systems are disinhibited. And they emerge in a particular way. And this is what's fascinating. And this is the neuropsychological slice on the notion that logos extracts order from chaos. The first thing that happens is that thalamic input goes to the amygdala. That's pretty cool, because there's only a couple of neuronal connections between the thalamus and the amygdala, so it's fast, 25 milliseconds. You're walking down the road, something moves in the bush beside you. You snap up in the air. You turn and you look at the thing, and you think, snake. Well, you're in the air. So what the hell's going on? Like, why are you there? Well, it's because the sensory thalamus fires some information into the amygdala that says, we need a real quick and dirty low-resolution picture of this unexpected occurrence. And the low-resolution image is high emotion, low detail. And the details are the sorts of things that I showed you with regards to Kelly. These underlying emotional systems are looking for danger. Motion, bared teeth, snakes, spiders, blood, dismembered bodies, etc., etc. They see any of those? Bang! You're in the air. You orient. Then you use these higher-order processing systems. Whap! One by one, in a temporal progression that might be as slow as a second or as long as months. Months being, if you encounter something really traumatic, takes you maybe your whole life to figure out what the hell it meant. And that means it takes you your whole life to actually construct a realistic memory of the event. Whatever. It takes you at least a second to think snake, and it only takes a snake 25 milliseconds to bite your leg. So if you're sitting around thinking snake, you're dead. So basically what happens is the brain constructs up a picture of the unexpected that looks like this. Chaos. And what's chaos? It's the pluripotentiality of everything. Then, affect, low-resolution stimulus images, things that are affectively charged because they're determined with regards to relevance for behavior. Then, increasingly, more detailed and elaborated cognitive models of objects and things, and finally, a complete adaptive representation of the circumstance. Now, the religious perspective says this. The chaos from which the brain extracts order is the fundamental ground of reality. And what that means essentially is that the notion that the creative word, logos, which really means something a lot more like creative, exploratory, communicative behavior, is, in a non-metaphorical way, the process that extracts the world out of chaos. And it's for that reason that, in Genesis, the Word of God is the creative force, and that in Christianity, Christ, who's the central creative hero, is the embodiment of logos. It's for that reason that in Genesis, human beings are considered as made in the image of God. And even more importantly, for those of you who are not particularly entranced by religious notions, every single culture on the planet that works is predicated on the idea that there's something divine about the individual, something ineffable, against which it is immoral for societies to transgress. Now, I don't know what you learned from 20th century history, but I'll tell you what I learned. What I learned was that societies that construct themselves on a framework that doesn't consider this real end up transforming the world into a place that's as close to hell as anything you could possibly imagine. Now, you can decide for yourself whether you think that's an accident or a metaphor. You know, we don't know much about time. We don't know much about what notions of eternal heaven and eternal hell might mean. We don't know where our past goes when it's gone. Now, we tend to think that it's gone, but we don't know that. Hell could easily be the domain that people who think they know absolutely everything, like Milton's Satan, necessarily create when they're given access to the power to make their beliefs manifest in the world. Well, I don't care what you can imagine with regards to terror and horror, but someone somewhere has acted out something far worse than that in the 20th century. And frequently the people who acted out those sorts of things were very much like you. Now that's a terrible thing to think. So how might you explain that? Well, I'll give you my 1-minute version and close off the talk. Look, you need the social world because it protects you, but it also crushes you, and it's blind and stupid, so it needs you. Because you have to act at the edges of the social world and constantly update it. It's a nice, paradoxical, mutual relationship. Well, you need chaos too, and this is Dostoevsky's example. You know, think if there was a utopia. Everything's perfect. You don't have to do anything. There's no challenges left to overcome. There's no novelty to reveal itself. Well, paradise for human beings is process and not state. We like to be involved and engaged in something we consider meaningful and important. We don't want to be at the end point of the journey. No one's more satisfied when a symphony is over than when it's playing. Paradise for us is a paradise of process, and that's identification with logos. Well, what happens if you refuse courageous identification with this spirit? Well, it's simple. It's your creative capacity and your exploratory courage that allows you to extract information from the world. You need that information to build your character. You need to build your character because life is hard. It's tragic. It's tragic because we're vulnerable. And if you don't take full advantage of everything the world offers you in terms of information, you'll make yourself weak. So every time you shy away from something you should explore, every time you shy away from your own intrinsic sense of meaning, you weaken your own personality. Literally. I don't mean metaphorically. I mean you weaken it. Well, what do weak people need? Well, they need strength. Weak people need totalitarian belief systems. They hide inside them like a turtle who won't put out its head hides inside a shell. And that means that individual cowardice and refusal to advance courageously into the unknown is the process that pathologizes social structure. And what that implies is something very much like religious traditions have always said, which is, in some weird way, you're the center of the world. Well, how about you construe that rationally? Think of a neural network. Mathematical demonstrations in the 1980s. You are connected to every single person in North America by a maximum of 4 intermediaries. You think that you're one mote among 6 billion, but you're not. You're at the center of a very interactive network. And everything you do, whether you know it or not, has a far greater effect than you can immediately see. So every cowardly decision that you take, cowardly defined on your own grounds, by the way, tilts the whole network towards a kind of chaos or pathological order. And every time you advance courageously and exist as an exemplar of appropriate being, then you improve the functioning of the entire unit. And that means that in a paradoxical way, as I said before, everybody can be reasonably construed as an embodiment of Christ. Well, you could say as well that there's a terribly negative aspect of that as well, which is that the alternative to that is to be an embodiment of the process that exists precisely in opposition to that. And it seemed to me, after thinking about it for many years, that the drama that we were playing out in the 1980s was precisely that. We were going to turn the world into something as close to hell as we could possibly imagine, or collectively, as individuals, we're going to keep the whole ball rolling and allow existence to continue to reveal itself despite its tragic nature as a consequence of participating voluntarily in this creative and courageous process. That's all I have to say.